The financial aid forms never even reached the desk. My father didn't let them live long enough to be considered. He crushed the pages in one hand while I was still speaking, compressing my future into a tight paper fist, then tossed it into the trash like it was a pizza flyer. No anger, no shouting, no lecture. That would have meant he cared. He looked bored, like I had interrupted something more important, like I was a dull meeting that could have been an email. He leaned back in his leather chair, the kind that swallows you whole, and the leather gave a slow creak in the silence of his office. Then he said it calmly, cleanly, without hesitation, like a man reading numbers off a report he had already approved. "You're dead capital, Fiona, an asset with no yield." The words were surgical, not meant to wound in a dramatic way, but to remove me from consideration entirely. I stood there and felt the air change, as if the room had decided I didn't deserve oxygen. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't plead, because pleading is what you do when you still believe someone has a heart you can reach. I just watched him pull out his checkbook as if we were discussing office supplies. He uncapped his fountain pen with deliberate care, and that small gesture felt more intimate than anything he'd ever offered me. Then he wrote a check for $5,000. Not to me. Not for tuition. Not for textbooks, rent, or anything that could keep me afloat. He wrote it for a luxury apartment security deposit for my twin sister, Bianca, like that was as natural as breathing. "She needs a proper environment to thrive," he said, pushing the check across the mahogany desk toward the empty chair beside me, not even bothering to place it in my hands. The dismissal was part of the performance. "You, on the other hand, are a write-off. Figure it out." My stomach tightened as if I'd swallowed ice. He said it so casually it felt like he had practiced saying it in a mirror. The way executives rehearse sentences that ruin lives. I left without slamming the door. Slamming is for people who still hope a noise can wake someone up. I closed it softly, the latch clicking like a restrained gasp. Upstairs, my bedroom waited. The smallest room, always the smallest room, the one that never got remodeled, never got the better furniture, never got the fresh coat Bianca's room got every year like she was a showroom display. My room felt like evidence that I was an afterthought, like the house had been built with the assumption that I wouldn't stay long. I didn't pack clothes. I didn't grab photos. I didn't take sentimental things because sentiment was something I couldn't afford anymore. I went straight to the vent under my desk, hands steady, pulse loud in my ears. I loosened it and pulled out the fireproof box I'd taped inside the ductwork years ago. Inside was not comfort. Inside was preparation. External drives, backups, an encrypted laptop my father didn't know existed. It wasn't rebellion. It was insurance. It was the quiet part of my life he never bothered to audit. Robert thought he was cutting off a helpless student. He thought he was severing a dependent from his budget. He forgot that being ignored makes you observant. While Bianca learned how to angle her face and smile for strangers, I learned how money moves when it's ashamed of itself. I learned how rich men hide their worst decisions behind polite words and complicated structures. I wasn't just studying. I was training. I sat on the floor and opened my laptop. I didn't cry because crying blurs your vision and I needed clarity. I connected to the house network one last time. His home server had a firewall that cost more than the tuition he refused to pay, and he bragged about it like it was a fortress. But arrogance always leaves a door cracked open. He reused passwords. He trusted familiarity. He assumed no one under his roof could think like him. One keystroke, and the screen shifted from lock to open. In that moment, the story changed. Tuition stopped being the goal. Survival stopped being the goal. Leverage became the only language worth speaking. I started a mirror copy of his entire financial history. Every tax filing. Every transfer that took a detour through a shell company. Every consulting fee that didn't match any real project. The progress bar crawled forward, slow and relentless. 10%, 20%. Each jump felt like my heart relearning how to beat. Downstairs, I heard champagne glasses clink. Laughter rose through the vents, warm and careless. They were celebrating Bianca's apartment, celebrating the shedding of dead weight, celebrating the way my father could erase a daughter and still sleep like a king. I let them laugh. Laughter makes people sloppy. It makes them forget their own footsteps. The download finished with a silent blink. I disconnected the drive, slipped it into my backpack, and stood up. I left my closet untouched. I left my bed unmade. I left the photos on the walls because my childhood was not worth more than proof. I walked down the stairs feeling a cold steadiness settle in my chest. Not happiness, something sharper, something like control. Outside, the night air bit at my skin. I didn't know where I would sleep, and that should have terrified me, but fear can't take up space when purpose is moving in. The backpack felt heavier than it should have, not because of the hardware, but because of what it represented. His entire life was in there, every hidden corner he assumed would never be touched. The war didn't start when he threw my forms away. It started when he decided I was too insignificant to watch. And to understand why I didn't hesitate, you have to understand the story didn't begin with tuition. Tuition was just the final invoice. The real deficit started months earlier, on a Tuesday morning in that driveway, when I stepped outside and saw something that didn't belong. A brand new pearl-white Porsche sat gleaming in the sun with a red ribbon across the hood like a fresh wound. Bianca was already inside, fixing the mirror, practicing her smile. My father stood beside it, beaming with a pride I'd never received. I knew what that car cost. I also knew how often I'd been told money was tight. Tight when I needed textbooks. Tight when tuition deadlines hit. Tight when the library cut my hours and I asked for help. I asked him where the money came from, and he answered without flinching, my grandmother's trust. The air left my lungs. That trust was meant for education, for both of us, the safety net that was supposed to keep us from drowning. I said it out loud, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. That was for college. That was for our future. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no warmth in it. You need to learn the difference between an expense and an investment, he said, and then he pointed at Bianca like she was a product on display. She's an investment. She'll meet people, make connections. She's the face of this family. Then he looked me up and down, taking inventory of my thrift store coat and scuffed boots. Your back-end support, a depreciating liability. Bianca revved the engine like punctuation. She didn't look at me. She laughed, waved at Dad, and sped away, tires screeching, leaving me standing there in the driveway like an embarrassing detail he didn't want photographed. My father watched her go with satisfaction, then turned toward the house without saying another word to me. 2 miles to the bus stop in the rain, because my place in the family had been assigned and enforced through small humiliations. But the rain has a way of clearing your mind. Standing under that shelter, watching water drip from the roof, I realized something he never accounted for. If I was back-end support, then I was also the one who saw the machinery. I knew where things were stored. I knew what was moved and when. I knew which numbers didn't make sense. You can mistreat a billboard, but you don't insult the person who keeps the books. You don't dehumanize the one person trained to notice patterns when you're living off deception. Back in the present, the invitation to family dinner arrived like a command, not a request. 7 p.m. sharp. Don't be late if you want your personal effects. That line made my stomach twist, like my belongings were hostages, like my life could be reduced to a box in the garage. I arrived at 6:59 because punctuality was one of the few weapons I'd always had. The dining room looked staged, too perfect, like a scene meant to convince outsiders this family was elegant rather than cruel. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and white lilies in the center that smelled like a funeral. My mother, Susan, sat arranging her napkin with nervous fingers, as if she could smooth out guilt by flattening fabric. Bianca had her phone propped up and the red live dot pulsed on the screen. She wasn't eating dinner. She was broadcasting it, turning private cruelty into public entertainment. Look who decided to join the real world, Bianca chirped to her followers as I entered. The exile returns. The word hit harder than it should have because she said it like a joke, like my pain was content. My father didn't stand. He didn't greet me. He gestured to the plate set in front of me, dried chicken, steamed vegetables, smaller than everyone else's, deliberately smaller. A reminder, a message. We're doing this for you, he said. Someday you'll thank us for tough love. Cutting you off is how we build your character. Susan nodded, pouring herself a generous glass of wine. We're teaching resilience, she added, voice thin, like she needed to hear herself say it. Bianca needs support because she has an image to maintain. You need to learn how to survive in the shadows. They weren't just justifying it. They were enjoying the story they told themselves. I lifted my fork slowly, keeping my face still. I refused to give them tears, refused to give them rage. Emotion is a gift, and they didn't deserve it. Thank you for the lesson, I said, voice flat enough to make Bianca blink. She giggled anyway, checking her view count like it was oxygen. She's so ungrateful, guys, she told the camera. Robert cleared his throat and reached under the table, producing a thick manila envelope. He slid it toward me, stopping short of my plate like even paper didn't want to touch me. Since you're officially independent, he said, almost cheerful, we need to tidy up some loose ends. Your grandmother opened a small custodial account for you when you were born. A few hundred. I need to close it to stop the maintenance fees. Sign the waiver transferring the balance to the family trust, and we'll call it even for your room and board. His voice was smooth, but his eyes watched my hands closely. This wasn't dinner. It was a trap. I opened the folder. The number inside didn't just surprise me. It confirmed everything. Over $400,000. Not a child. Few hundred, but a real sum, the kind you move only when you think no one can connect the dots. I already knew what it was because I'd been auditing him in silence for months. He'd been funneling money into my name to hide it, disguising it as gifts, using me as a shield. He assumed I wouldn't read. He assumed I'd sign just to escape the room. I scanned the paperwork, and there it was, printed like a confession. The listed source of funds, tied neatly to the consulting revenue from the very shell structure he used to collect kickbacks. If I signed, he didn't just get permission to move the money. He got my name stamped onto the chain of custody. He got a document he could point to later and say I knew. He was trying to make me complicit. Is there a problem? He asked, his tone tightening, eyes narrowing as if he could pressure truth into obedience. I looked up slowly and let silence stretch just long enough to make Susan's fingers twitch. Then I said, no problem, I'm just admiring your record keeping. The misspoken word would have given me away if I had let my voice shake, but I didn't. I signed my name with a flourish that felt almost theatrical, because in that moment I understood something intoxicating. He thought he was collecting my surrender. He was actually handing me evidence. He snatched the papers back with a triumphant smirk, already imagining the money safe under his control. Good, he said, tucking the envelope into his jacket like it was a prize. Now finish your vegetables. You can't afford to waste food anymore. I took a bite of the dry chicken and forced myself not to smile. It tasted like the moment before a storm breaks. The next move was not impulsive. It was precise. The building of Vance and Associates rose like a glass blade against the sky, nothing like my father's dark, wood-paneled world of old money and private intimidation. This was where reputations were built and destroyed in daylight. Professor Vance was my father's corporate rival, the man assigned to audit the merger my father wanted so badly he could taste it. I walked into the lobby wearing the only suit I owned, a charcoal thing bought years ago for a college competition, and I carried a single folder filled with selected pages from my father's server. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't have a glossy resume. I had proof and the kind of desperation that turns fear into focus. The receptionist tried to stop me, but I leaned forward and said, "Tell him this file contains the reason his audit is about to fail." 3 minutes later, I was in a corner office that smelled like espresso and quiet authority, watching Vance flip through my documents with the attention of a man who recognizes blood in the water. He paused on one page and his eyebrows lifted. "This looks like a minor discrepancy," he said, still not looking at me, voice controlled. "Could be rounding." I shook my head. "It's a pattern," I said. "Every transaction ends the same way. It's not a vendor code, it's a routing signature." I watched the moment his expression changed, not to shock but to interest. He looked at me like a jeweler looks at a rough stone, calculating what it could become. "Who are you?" he asked. My hands were cold, but my voice held. "I'm the person who knows where the rest of the zeros are," I said, "and I'm looking for a job." He closed the folder, studying me. "You start Monday," he replied. "Junior analyst, don't make me regret it." I walked out of that office knowing I had just stepped into a different kind of battlefield, one where paperwork could hit harder than fists. For months, I lived inside that world. I came in before sunrise and left when the city was already asleep. I traced shell companies through layers of distance and polite labeling. I followed transfers that hopped between jurisdictions like they were trying to lose their own shadows. I built maps of corruption so detailed they felt like they could be framed and hung on a wall, except they were too ugly to be art. But the real target, the thing that mattered most, was still the custodial account. The money my father wanted to steal without consequences. 2 days before graduation, late at night, I accessed the banking portal using credentials pulled from his server months earlier. My heart hammered hard enough to bruise my ribs. I entered the account number and hit enter. The screen flashed a warning. Account closed. Panic surged up my throat, hot and sharp. Then I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to think, and dug past the surface into the raw logs. That's where I found the truth. A transfer scheduled for the next day. He hadn't taken it yet. It was sitting in escrow, still legally tied to me. Midnight was the line. On my birthday, ownership shifted. No speeches, no candles, no celebration. Just a legal switch turning in the dark. The second the clock crossed, I filed the reclamation claim and redirected the money into a private trust he couldn't touch without exposing himself. $450,000 moved before his morning coffee cooled. Game over. The next day, I walked across the graduation stage as valedictorian and locked eyes with the man who once called me dead capital. The applause around us sounded distant, muffled by the rush of blood in my ears. He didn't clap. He just stared, face tightening as if he could squeeze time backward. After the ceremony, outside in the bright air, he grabbed my arm and demanded the money like I owed him for existing. I showed him the empty account and watched his confidence crack. If he challenged me, he'd have to explain the source, the kickbacks, the shell company. And somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, not for drama, but like a warning that the world was finally noticing what he had been doing in silence.